Hey, how's everyone doing? This is Vito coming to you from New Jersey in the United States, and I'm here with my good friend Lucas in jolly old. We got a little bit of a time difference here, but I think
There
it's past noon in both places. Cheers, man.
we go. Cheers. Yeah. Evening all. This is my Dorset IPA. We're going on holiday to Dorset on Monday, so I thought it made
Oh, it's
sense.
great.
Dorset is South Coast, and it looks like the weather might actually be nice, which is a rare treat for
I'm
us.
drinking my usual. I have a Heineken here, and then I have a Sam Adams Boston Lager in case I need
Oh,
that. But
okay.
I like this Heineken. Apparently won a gold medal in Paris in 1875. So that's
Relevant,
impressive.
topical.
Relevant.
Yep. Yeah, yeah. And that Heineken, is that going to go up in price for you, like 20% or something? I don't know what
I'm gonna
you know,
yeah,
the
these
law.
these fancy imported beers are gonna be out of my price range.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, and for the purposes of this podcast, I think I should probably talk 10% less than normal because you've
Yeah,
imposed
well,
10% tariffs on us. So,
yes, that's right. That's right.
Mm.
We got to protect my job. Uh,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, here I am coming
well,
over
so once again,
virtually.
we're here. We're at the we're running our uh, podcast, our the Light Brigade, right? And it's we usually discuss two different works that we consider to be canonical works of literature. But today we're going to discuss a book that I think stands alone in many ways. It's Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. It's a very controversial book. There's a lot to say about it. I think we prudently decided not to compare it with anything else because, quite frankly, I'm afraid to look for anything else that shares that subject matter. And there are a lot of issues with this book, both within the text and I think outside of the text that we need to delve into, and could be enlightening, especially about modern attitudes. I don't know. You want to give a rundown of the plot of the book in case anyone who's are legions of fans haven't read this book or haven't heard
Yeah,
of it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, before we do though, I wonder if it's worth talking about what preconceptions. I know you read it quite a long time ago, but I'd never read it before,
Mhm.
and I don't. But it's a very well known book, and it has a certain place, doesn't it, in our culture, pop culture. There are, there's like it's mentioned in a Katy Perry song. I think it's mentioned in
A police song. Don't
a
stand
Police
so
Don't
close
Stand
to
So
me.
Close
Yeah.
to Me. Lana Del Rey.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned it in the little write up I have here, which I think is interesting. It says Lana's persona often draws from the Lolita archetype, a mix of innocent seduction and doomed
Yeah.
beauty. And I
Right.
think that's what I was always confused about this, that I couldn't quite understand. Was it about, a very attractive young woman like seducing, but young, legal young, if you know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Right.
Or is it pedophilia? And even the edition I have has, she looks kind of,
Yeah.
she could be like 18 and, like a homewrecker type, but not,
Yeah. I
like,
think I think it kind of straddles a line, right? Because
mm,
I mean, for most, I made this point to you just in conversation
mm,
before that for most of human history, right? I mean, and the character Humbert in the book mentions several times that
makes this argument. Yeah.
children become sexually mature at about 12, 13 years old. So technically, I mean, yes, statutorily, we know that children are not. We consider them to not be able to make free choices. They can't consent. But for most of human history, lifespans were shorter. There was really no concept before the Victorian age of childhood as a time of innocence. Children died so often in childbirth that I feel like for most of human history, parents kind of had a sort of they decathected from children until they reached a certain age because if you're going to invest in this kid, the chances are that a child would die before the age of 5 was very high. So I think
Yeah.
that plays a part in it, but that's just to explain it. I mean, our attitude towards it. This seems to be one of those things where everybody just agrees it's abhorrent for a man to be or anyone to be sexually attracted to children. Although we do have a lot of cases where teachers at high schools will,
Yeah.
female teachers will
Quite
puzzlingly
recently, there
have
was
these
one of those
affairs.
also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
happens all the time, and I don't think anybody really. It doesn't really. There's not the same reaction. There's not the same visceral reaction of disgust against it when a woman is doing it to a teenage boy. I
That's
think
true.
that's sort of for men. It's like, hey,
Mm.
good job. But
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I think I don't, I wouldn't argue against anything that you've said there, right? In terms of like things were different in the days of Rome and whatnot. Um, and maybe it is accepting that a lot of your what feel like very visceral reactions are in some way culturally conditioned.
conditions. Yeah, right.
For a great postmodernist insight, right? I'm completely grossed out by it. I
Yeah.
don't want to like make out that, and I found it very difficult to read as a result. And actually, I was very confused when I first started reading it because, for the reasons I just gave, I felt like in pop culture it was talked about as a kind of, that she's like sexy or, seductive
No,
as
she's not. She's not. The way
no,
he
she's not
describes her is
at
like she's
all.
just like a grubby little
She's a kid.
tomboy. And
Yeah, exactly.
you
And
know
and
what? I would like to
but
just
sorry,
say
just
what.
let me
Go
carry
ahead.
on because I think uh some of the quotes on my book jacket really confused me as well. And this my edition is 2006, so it's not like another age, but it's got a Martin Amis quote. Comedy subversive yet divine. It's got a quote from the Independent, which is a left-leaning newspaper here in
Yeah.
England. There's no funnier monster in modern literature than poor doomed Humbert Humbert. Going to hell in his company would always be worth the ride. That's like what a little rascal. You know what I mean? And then the Daily Telegraph, the kind of people call it the Tory Graph, so a right-leaning newspaper, laugh out loud black humour.
Hmm.
John Updike,
Yeah.
redeeming. I don't know who that guy is. You might know.
Yeah. He's
Redeeming splendid. Yeah,
he
go
was a
on.
famous American author. Actually, my edition here, the 50th anniversary
Oh,
edition from Vintage International, has a quote by Updike as well on the back. He
is
says,
it redeeming splendid? No, you go.
"Now
You
he
do.
says Nabokov writes prose the only way it should be written. That is ecstatically." That's all he says.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so mine is him. It says redeeming, splendid, headlong, endlessly comic and evocative. And then I've got from The Guardian, that bastion of left wing thought, a great novel. It widens our own humanity. And when we get into this, maybe this is not a conversation for now.
Right.
This is 2006. I find it, and maybe those quotes aren't taken from 2006, but I find it very, very hard to believe it
Oh
would
yeah.
be packaged up and talked about in this way.
I don't think so, but it just shows you how things change. The other quote on the back of mine is from Vanity Fair, the only convincing love story of our century. Right? This book was
What?
originally released in 1955, right? And Nabokov says that he was kind of naive. He had to have it released through a publisher of erotica, but he didn't know that the publisher was primarily a publisher of erotica. And the publisher basically said, if I publish this book, we're both going to go to jail. There's just no way, you know? There's no way.
Yeah.
And yet, and yet here it is, right? There's a famous book called Reading Lolita in Tehran, where
Mm.
women in the Muslim world read this, and they're not shocked about it at all. They're like,
No,
this
fair
is
point.
standard, this
Mm.
is very
Mm.
standard stuff. It is
Yeah.
culturally conditioned. I think what you mentioned before, you're feeling that it's rebarbative in a certain way. It brings up that interesting point. I know Alex O'Connor often talks about this, where he says that he's an ethical emotivist, where he believes that our ethical impulses are really expressions of our emotions. Like if something
Mm.
disgusts us,
Oh,
we
definitely.
want
Yeah.
we want some objective
Mm.
way of saying this is wrong. And this is one of
Mm.
those subjects that I think really explodes a landmine underneath all of that, because we know for a fact that for most of human history, children of 13, 14 years old were the objects of adult
Mm.
sexual desire, and it wasn't
Interest.
considered
Yeah.
odd in any way, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Until the last, I don't know, 200 years, say.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
things changed, right? Maybe we
I
would say
can't believe
that's
I can't believe that quote that it's the most what is it? Say that again. The most realistic love story of our time. Say that again.
the only convincing love story of our century, of the
What a
20th
claim that
century.
is. That is
Yeah.
extraordinary.
But
Wow.
so I think
I
the
mean,
thing.
personally, if I think if the book came out now and someone said that about it, that person will have a knock on the door from the police and they'll be checking that guy's hard drive.
Well,
Like,
that's the thing about Nabokov. So people often say, look, there's you don't want to say that the author is the character. You want to put that aside. But Nabokov clearly had an interest in this subject. He
mm,
wrote a story called The Enchanter, I believe, before this, about a similar character who was a jeweler who was infatuated with young girls. And he ends up getting killed in a really tragic way. But he expanded on this story for Lolita. Now, Nabokov was a Russian aristocrat. He was born in 1899 in
yeah.
Russia. He moved to
Townhouse in St. Petersburg,
went to
Dacia in
France.
the
He
country.
had an English nurse, which is why he could speak English
I mean, what
fluently.
what a sign of what a sign of affluence that is. Yeah.
Yeah, and he wrote. I mean, the way he writes to me is after I read him, I can't read anything else for a long time because he's such a genius. The way he writes his prose like crackles. It has such clarity. It's beautiful and it's full of wordplay and puns. And you read it. You could read this book. This is one of those books I think you can read at different points in your life, and you're going to get a different
Yeah.
thing out of it, right?
Get
When
that.
I read
Yeah.
it the first time, let's say I was 25, I think about it differently now that I'm 43. I'm almost 44. So
Mm.
obviously I have children myself. So obviously my thought process
So
is
I was
different.
gonna say I wondered if that's why, and we will do the sort of brief plot synopsis. But Cards on the Table, I hated it. I had
Right,
a
right,
quite
right.
visceral hatred of it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it wasn't. There's kind of different levels, and I think one way to always judge it is, I work during the day, and then in the evening, after the kids are in bed, I will read. Cheers. And I kind of judge how much I'm enjoying a book by, during the day, do I find myself thinking, oh, I'm really looking forward to getting down on the sofa and reading my book,
Yeah.
or am I dreading it, or do I kind of not care? And I never dreaded it at all because it is well written, it's well paced, the story is good. There's even like some interesting elements of suspense and stuff, right?
Right.
But to your point, I think of the time at which you read it. I have three daughters. You have two daughters. Maybe if when I'd read it and I was 25,
Yeah.
childless, it would have been different. But I found it really difficult, and it probably, and what probably didn't help actually was being told by everyone that I was about to read this stunning prose.
Yeah.
Because for me, it didn't quite hit that expectation, if I'm honest,
Okay.
and I found it at times quite pretentious and
Oh
annoying.
yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
and I wonder if there's like a bit of old British class system here, whereas there's the sense of this guy like trying a bit too hard.
He's
And
he's certainly a very pedantic character.
yeah,
He's
well, the
he's
characters, the characters like the proper like, oh, I'm like a refined European gentleman amongst these
yes.
uncouth Americans, and it's like, oh, come on.
Well, Nabokov
And
also has
and
another
nothing
series.
nothing will get the backup of an Englishman, I think, more than constant unnecessary French asides.
Oh well,
That's so annoying.
you know what? I brought this along too because I have Christopher Hitchens'
I know
list
something like
of
that here as well.
essays, and he's got one in here about Nabokov and Lolita, and he says something along the lines of he's like like Nabokov. When euphemism is required, I tend to dissolve into French as well.
That's interesting. I
There you
must
go.
read that. I had no idea that was in there.
Yeah, he says basically a few things, and he points out that the subject of incest is mentioned in this book, but he says, it's like the fact is that Lolita is not really his daughter, right?
Mm.
He's like, if Lolita had actually been his daughter, it would be a whole different story, right? I doubt anyone would have read it, you know.
Mm.
So there is a slight remove, right? It's like it's not really incest because it's not really his daughter. I think crucially, he is a pedophile, but he is a heterosexual pedophile. I think that wouldn't have gone over well if it had been otherwise,
That's
especially at
interesting.
the time. So while
God,
he's
isn't that a fascinating insight into the values of yeah.
yeah, well, like I said, we
Yeah,
have different
yeah, yeah.
intuitions when a teenage boy is sleeping with his 25-year-old teacher. No one thinks there's really anything that wrong with it. Legally, yes, but I think our intuitions go a different way when a 40-year-old man wants to sleep with a 13-year-old girl. We have a different
Very good
feeling
point.
towards it, and
Absolutely.
especially if he was a homosexual pedophile, I think that's the most we would judge that the most harshly.
Hmm.
And we know because that's unfortunately the Catholic Church has disgraced
Yeah.
itself over the last few decades. As a matter of fact, one of the worst offenders was the Archbishop of Newark, New Jersey, named Theodore McCarrick, and I just heard
Really?
today that he passed away. But
Mm.
he was a homosexual pedophile, and he harbored them in his own. He harbored priests who were doing that. So I mean, the way people felt about that, and the fact that there was no real accountability, they tried to hide these guys from the law by using the church. The Vatican's a
Mm.
country, technically. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to that.
It's
But
the
anyway,
it's the I think, I wonder if it's new, but I definitely feel like pedophilia, noncing, as we say
yeah,
that probably gets. I think both of those words mean will get like hard to find on YouTube or something. I think people say PDF files on YouTube to otherwise
yeah,
you can't. But I'm sure our fans are dedicated enough to find us, Vito. But I think in modern Britain anyway, the worst thing you can be.
oh
Maybe
yeah.
alongside being a racist or and like racism more left wing coded as the worst thing you can be. Pedophilia more right wing coded as the worst thing you can be.
Well, isn't that the greatest fear that people have? I'll hear people say that they have this new terminology for pedophilia, which is like MAP, minor attracted
Minor attracted
persons.
persons, yeah,
So like
and
this
that
is
and
going to
in
be
the
the new woke crusade for
right,
rights,
and there was an attempt, I think in the 70s and 80s, a very
Yeah.
progressive attempt to make it, more permissive.
There's an organization called NAMBLA, right, which is the North American Man Boy Love Association. And as a matter of fact, when I was in high school, the principal of my high school was arrested for involvement with this. They would meet up with teenage boys in parks, and he
Oh
was
my
caught by the
gosh!
police, and he went to prison. So we
Wow,
people were shocked by this, and rightfully so. But the fact that
that
there's an
is shocking.
organization that has a name
Right?
is kind of crazy to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah.
So it grows out
It's
of
mad.
this. Yeah, I mean, it grows out of this thing. I mean, I know, and we know that the ancient Greeks practiced a certain type of pedophilia, right? The Erastes and the
Man, boy love,
Ereminos.
perhaps as
Yeah,
they would,
the
as
Erastes and the Ereminos, and it was
yeah.
it was put in this context of the boy was being taught by the man in some way. And then in Renaissance Italy, I listened to a what's it called, a lecture that was given. I saw, remember the video that you saw David Starkey in Oxford. Well, there was another
Hmm.
scholar in the same series who was giving a speech about homosexuality and how it was,
Right.
as a concept. And he
Ugh.
basically said when it came to buggery, in England it was basically unknown until the 1600s. In Italy, it was well known before that. And the idea seemed to be that when you were a kid, you were going to get buggered by older men. And then when you got older, you could do it to the younger kids. It was just this idea. Mainly in Florence, that this came out of.
Such a beautiful city. It's so
Yeah. But this
And
is sort
call
of
them.
off the subject, right? So
Yeah.
Lolita is
Yeah.
about a heterosexual heterosexual pedophile named Humbert Humbert, which is an alias, right? So the book starts with a letter from a writer. He's received this manuscript from a lawyer who is Humbert's lawyer. He's died. He died of a heart attack while he was in prison awaiting trial, right? And we find out later that this character Lolita, Dolores Hayes, she's died too in childbirth. And you find out
Sorry. So
at the beginning, yeah.
yeah, so I didn't read the forward because I'm
Oh, okay.
so used to getting, when you buy like an old book, classic
Yeah.
book, there's always a forward by some professor. And you're like, actually, I want to read the book first before you tell me how to read the book. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So I skipped it and I only read, and then I went back to it at the end. And I was like, oh, bollocks. This was part
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
actual
yeah.
thing.
That was vital to the whole thing because you learn at the
Yeah.
beginning that, and then you learn at the end actually that
But,
the only
but,
reason
but,
you're
but,
reading this manuscript is because they're both dead. Because Humbert says,
yes.
"Don't release this until both of us are dead."
But I think if you read it for the first time and you do read the forward, I don't think you realize that Dolores Lolita is dead because it doesn't call her that. It calls her Mrs. Schiffer or whatever it is, the name of the guy she goes on to marry, like right at the end of the book. So
Yes, right.
you wouldn't know that that's Lolita, and if you're fair play, if you manage to remember that name until page
Yeah,
350, but you probably have forgotten. So maybe I think kind of almost in a way I read it the right way, because it doesn't say Lolita dies. It
yeah.
says try to find the bit, but yeah, it
Schiller,
says
Schiller, Lolita,
Schiller,
yeah,
yeah,
Dolores
Mrs. Paul
Schiller.
Schiller dies, yeah.
Right. And so this is the story, right? So you go into this and the way that the guy who writes the forward said frames it is that essentially this guy Humbert he wrote this manuscript. He's like, I didn't even have to edit it. It's so well written. I'm just going to leave it as is. He's using a pseudonym that he's made up, which is very bizarre. But be that as it may, we think this man basically said this is going to be a manuscript that I'm sure people in abnormal psychology will value in coming years as a case study.
Mm.
And they go into the story, and you meet Humbert, and he describes himself as a European. He's a native speaker of French. He grew up in Paris. His father was a nightclub owner, and he describes this love affair he had as a young as a young teenager with this girl who later died of like the flu or something like that, or she died of some disease, right?
Typhoid, I think, one of those typhus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he describes his realization that as a grown man, that he's a pedophile, but that he's trying to recapture this. He's trying to find a stand-in for this young girl that he lost in his life. You know, he comes to the United States. He's living in the U.S. He works. What is he's like? He's an academic, basically, right? He's trying to publish a. He's publishing a dictionary in French or something like that, right? It's never really clear what he does for a living, but he has some sort of an income, right? And he goes and he becomes a lodger at this house in this. I believe it's implied that it's in New England. It's like a New England college town, and he goes to this woman's house as a boarder, Mrs. Charlotte Hayes, Haze. That's also a pseudonym. That's not their real name. It just rhymes.
Yeah.
Hayes rhymes with. It's got to be like Maze or something like that. But that doesn't
Hmm.
really make
Yeah.
any difference, right?
Yeah.
And there he sees that she has a young daughter named Dolores, and he becomes infatuated with Dolores. So he decides to stay on at the house. He's watching her. He's plotting. How can I touch her? How can I become involved with her? And finally, he gets a letter from the mother, who's kind of a she's a widow. She's kind of a silly and self-absorbed woman that he considers a cow. He calls her Vosh-like, which I love.
But he talks
He,
about all adult women
yeah,
with
it's
a great
disgusting.
deal of
Yeah,
disgust. Like, yeah, it's quite interesting in the prose actually when he talks about how. So he calls the age rate, the kind of women he's attracted to, nymphets. Nymphets?
yes,
I don't know how you would say it.
nymphets. Yeah,
And these are like I think we're just kind of 11 to 14 or something like that, isn't it?
Yeah,
Very short window for him, and it just quite interesting to describe it as like it's horrifying for him to watch them be eaten by the
yeah,
woman they grow up to be, right?
yeah.
And and obviously his first wife he was abusive to in really quite horrible ways. So yeah.
It's interesting how he has this very strong vocabulary of disgust. He's disgusted
Mm,
by uh, the way he describes adult women. They're fat. They smell bad. Like he describes things in such a viscerally repellent way. Like the way
mm,
he's always describing how something stinks or something's this or that,
yeah.
slimy or. And he even describes himself that way. He says he's
Mm,
got
absolutely.
like a cesspool of rotting monsters behind his teeth.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So he's disgusted with himself. It's not like he doesn't know that this is really a horrible attraction to have. And he says very often, he goes, I wish I was the type of guy who could just go and satisfy himself by getting, prostitutes who look young. He goes, that would be
Which he does
fine.
do.
He does do, but he can't limit
Mm.
himself to
It's
that
not enough for
because
him. Yep.
because it's not. I would argue because it's not primarily a sexual attraction for him. He's actually like he actually does in some way want to be in love and have a relationship with a girl, but this love is destructive. He recognizes that this love destroys him and the girl, right? But he can't help himself. And he talks about this all the time. He's trying to, I think in writing this, he's trying to show, he keeps addressing himself to gentlemen of the jury because he knows this will be read at his trial. And he keeps saying he's trying to explain himself in a way that, will sort of make them sympathetic to him. In a certain way, that's the genius of the book. I brought up before, Kingsley Amis famously said, the problem with this book is not that it's pornographic, it's that it's not pornographic enough. Because you become comfortable very quickly with the subject. And you just go, well, this guy is a
Mm.
you find yourself I found myself liking the guy. Like he's pedantic, but he's witty and he's interesting. And you go, oh, I forget sometimes. You have to keep reminding yourself this guy's kind of a monster.
Mm.
You
Mm.
have to keep reminding yourself. I think that's what Amos meant. He's like, it's not pornographic enough. If it was more pornographic, it would be easier to feel that moral outrage that you have to keep. Found I have to keep reminding myself of as I was reading along.
Yeah.
It normalizes it. That's the achievement of Nabokov in writing it. I think he normalizes something that people have very strong moral indignation against.
Everyone is humanized when you see the world through their perspective,
Yeah.
aren't they? I think that's the insight there. I have to admit though, I never really found myself cheering for him or on his side. Maybe because of all the French asides and things. um,
I
but
find him to
yeah,
be he's a very
you know,
self-pitying person too, and
mm,
he admits that. So, well, anyway, to go on with the story, right?
that's
So
not the most attractive quality.
eventually he Charlotte Hayes, the mother, leaves him a letter saying, "I'm in love with you. Please move out unless you're willing to get married to me." And he
And this is
decides,
when she goes to drop her off, Lolita, at a summer camp.
right. And he
Glorious.
accepts the marriage proposal and forces himself to have sex with her because he wants to basically, he marries the mother to be able to have his way with the daughter,
Access.
right?
Yep.
Now he keeps a diary where he describes his lust for Dolores, who he calls Lolita, and his disgust for Charlotte, and she finds the key to his trunk where he keeps it, and she reads it eventually.
Yep.
And he comes in, and she accuses him. She's writing letters, and she's gonna
This is after they've
divorce
been
him.
married, but before Dolores has come back from the summer camp.
Yeah, they haven't been married for long, a couple of months
A
only.
few weeks. Yeah.
And the way he describes it, she runs out of the house. They live on a street that's on an incline. There's a hill there, and she runs across the street to mail these letters, and she gets hit by a car, and she's killed. Now, you had a different idea about this, right? He had been fantasizing about killing the mother, like marrying her, then killing her, so he could have his way with Lolita. But you thought that because Humbert is such an unreliable narrator, that you think he killed her, right?
I think he killed her. Yeah.
Well, so how do you think that worked?
I just think it's remarkably convenient that the moment she finds the letter, literally like within a few minutes of that coming to a head, she gets hit by a car on a pretty standard residential street.
Mm,
He also fantasizes about murdering her before
yeah.
that several times. I mean, yeah, I think she found the letter, he killed her, and the way he acts after that as well is very much like everything he wanted to do, right? He wanted to have access to her, he wanted Charlotte out of the way, and off he goes about fulfilling that.
Well, do you think? I mean, yes, he does, but the only thing that makes me doubt that is, I mean, now you know later in the book, Lolita keeps mentioning to him as an aside that my mother was murdered, right? Something like that. She she says, he says that he actually says he murdered her too, or he heavily implies it. But the thing that makes me doubt that he actually murdered her is that although he is an unreliable narrator, the way he describes it happening, there were other people who witnessed it. So it's not like he could have killed her and then thrown her body in the street. I think he thinks that he's responsible for it because his obsession with Lolita actually led directly to these turn of events, right? He actually drove her out of the house, to mail these letters by her discovering his. And he says to himself, he's like, I shouldn't have kept this diary. I could have just, I should have just destroyed it. I don't know why I kept the evidence there where she could get it. So I think at a certain level he feels responsible for it, but I don't think he just made that story up. Like I think it did happen. I think he just feels that he's responsible for it. Like
I think
I don't think
I
he's
think
insane, you know?
I think Nabokov at least wants us suspicious of it.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, he wants us to feel uneasy about it, but to
Yeah.
still, in kind of in the way you're describing, to still kind of by default take his side
Yeah.
or take or believe. But he talks about, oh, isn't this like wonderfully convenient?
Yeah.
He writes about poisoning her. He writes about he's got all these plans, and then she reads them. You
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
wonder like what was the plan?
Yeah.
What was he gonna do? I mean, what was the plan if she was to stay alive? Let alone what was the plan
Mm.
after no, what was the plan if she hadn't read the letter?
Yeah. I mean,
Let alone
Charlotte
after
is
the letter.
a kind of a silly and self-absorbed person, and she has a very fraught relationship with her daughter. They don't have a good
Yeah,
relationship
she
at
doesn't.
all.
Again, though,
Maybe it's him. Maybe he's saying that.
yeah. Again, so you're hearing it through his perspective, and he's at pains to tell us all the times that Charlotte talked about Dolores as not being great and not loving her and stuff. And
Well, he says later in the book, there was a great
yeah,
line. He says, I presumed too much on this bad relationship because Dolores later realizes after they've been in this, this relationship
yeah,
that even a bad family life is preferable uh, to a life of incest, So
yeah,
he
what
says
they
that
have.
she.
Yeah,
Right. He was like, it's a farce, right? It's a simulacrum of family life that he goes, that's the best I can
yeah.
offer her, though. So anyway, after Charlotte dies, he buries her, and he tells, since Lolita is still at the summer camp, he tells Lolita that his mother got sick and is in the hospital. And then they leave the town, and he drives around, and they're staying at motels all the time until finally he has to reveal to her that his mother died, and he rapes her essentially the first time in one of these hotels after drugging her with sleeping pills.
Now he would like us to believe. So one thing that's in there as well is he has his first sexual experience with Lolita before she goes off to the summer camp, where he essentially like
Mm,
masturbates with her
yes,
there without her realizing, more or less.
right.
And then but then he does want us to think there's been some like flirtation between the two, and that she's been writing like his initials in a heart on the walls and things like that.
I mean, even if so,
And
right? I mean, that may be
oh,
true.
of
It
course,
doesn't, you know.
but it's I think it's a very common pedophile PDF file. It's a very common thing apparently that they will say, "Oh, I didn't seduce her; she seduced me." They will
Yeah.
very often roll that out, and it's kind of probably a delusion, but and probably a unreliable narrator thing. That's what they want to believe.
Well,
It's what they've
I
been
mean,
telling
even if
themselves.
that were, even if she was attempting to seduce him, he should have realized as a grown man that she doesn't understand what that entails. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And
But
he
I'm
points
just
out
saying
later
again.
that she cries every time he has sex with her. You know?
That's so. I think that's really interesting, right? Because
Yeah.
yeah. So the first time he implies that it's consensual.
Yeah.
That doesn't, of course, given her age, that doesn't make it okay or legal or whatever. Although I think at that point, actually, in some states, it is legal. He keeps telling us. Again, he's always defending himself, isn't he?
Yeah.
But yes, I kind of think you get the impression as you get. I remember definitely thinking at a period of the book, maybe to your quote about the love story, we're meant to believe that these two are in. And he kind of, it's almost like he drip feeds us the information that makes it very clear how incredibly coercive this relationship
Yes.
is. So
He's
he
bribing
reveals
her essentially all the time. You know, saying,
all the time.
I'll take you where you want to go as long as you do your duty. You know, to me,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is
And
sexual favors.
yeah, and that piece about crying, that she cries after she thinks he's asleep.
Yeah.
He tells us that really late on.
Yeah.
Really, but he gives us this sense that like it's all a bit rubbish, that he wants something from her and she gives it, but their relationship is not good. But you only
Yeah.
start to develop that feeling quite slowly, and then after they've been doing this motel thing for ages, they then go back they go to a new town, don't they? Where she goes
Yeah.
to a posh private school,
Right.
and
He enrolls her in the Beardsley School, and this is where
basically,
she starts to see, an outside world that she wants to be part of, and she convinces him to let her become part of part of a play. And they do a
yeah,
play by a local playwright named Claire Quilty, who becomes a important character in the last part of the book.
right. But
Quilty,
just before we launched that, so that's when at that stage is when the relationship has become incredibly transactional. It's kind of the
yeah,
dark, maybe the darkly funny piece again is he
yeah,
doesn't he starts that chapter, doesn't he? I'm afraid I must tell you now about a drop in Lolita's character
yeah,
because she started really extorting him for
yes,
money
yes,
and every other thing she wants under the sun.
yeah. Right, and it's the idea that he's her father in some way. They keep up
Yeah,
this myth, but it's
father
like
daughter.
it's very weird, and I don't
Mm.
know. He doesn't get into what she must be thinking about this whole thing. She understands that she can get something from him, but it's not clear what she thinks or feels about it, other than that he admits that she cries after they engage in coitus, if you want.
Yeah, but again, like yet there's no theory of mind, is there, for Dolores? We're never
No.
told what she might be thinking or feeling. We just get these little snippets from him.
Yeah, glimpses,
The
right?
one, the one that I always think about is such a disgusting and sad thought, but he talks about how after he's raped her, he would like hold her and cry and talk about how bad a person he is.
And then
And
he would
then
get, yeah,
she'd feel him get aroused again, and while she's comforting him, she'd be like, "Oh no," because she knows
this
it's going to
again,
happen
yeah.
again. And it's that part I can't get that out of my head. It's just so like
That's
powerfully
that's
gross.
that
And
stuck with me too. But he
mm,
has some. There's another part where he says something that's really really demented, right? Where he says he wanted to impregnate Lolita so that she would give him a
oh,
granddaughter, and then he could do the same thing to. Now he's talking about doing this to his own
his
progeny,
own
right?
actual daughter, yeah, and
Right.
because he's talking about that, for him, she's approaching this cliff edge. God forbid she's going to be a 15,
Yeah.
16-year-old girl, and
Well, he calls her like
Yeah, so he's like
his
thinking long
older.
term now. He's like, how can I make this work for me? Oh, I'll
Yeah.
impregnate her, and then I've only got to wait like 11. Oh, it's
You
oh,
remember after he sleeps with her, that he rapes her the first time. He's trying to clean the room up so that the housekeepers. He
yeah,
says this wonderful line. He says, so that I arranged the bedspread so that it would look like the nest of a restless father and his tomboy daughter instead of a an ex-convict Saturnalia with two fat
yeah,
whores.
yeah. He definitely has a sense that it's like gross. Do you know? Yeah, as you said, he's disgusted by himself. He is.
Yeah, no, he is, and he definitely has a death wish, I believe, right? I think he thinks to himself that, you know, he he's like, my love can only lead to destruction. I can only destroy this child, for my my selfish desire. But I do, like, I think he does feel love, like, in other words, if it was just a sexual thing, he wouldn't have felt the need to go this far, right? And the fact that he can't strongly implies, I think that's the most unsettling thing, which is that, nymphetomania, or whatever you want to call it, I think he uses that word, is actually a form of love. But it's a
Uh,
highly destructive form of love, and it has to
uh,
be, it must not be accepted. But
yeah,
it may be
yeah.
real. You know what I'm saying?
You know,
That's I think one of the things you have to consider.
yes, I think that's it. It is a kind of mania, and one thing I remember messaging you while we were reading it because it was really kind of starting to freak me out was, I consider myself a red-blooded male, um,
Yeah,
but this guy, he needs it so badly. Do you know what I mean? He's blowing up the
yeah,
world for it, and
yeah,
even on a kind of physiological difference, he needs it like several times a day.
yeah.
Like he refers to like needs,
And he's
and
like a 40-year-old man. Like he's
yeah,
extremely sexually
the libido is
potent
insane.
for
Yeah,
for a 40-year-old guy.
yeah, and you'd think like, and he's just like motel day after day. Like
Yeah,
it does make you kind of think like obviously there's on the one hand I'm different to this guy in that I don't have the same like type of person that I'm interested in, but then equally is there's almost something like intense about the way in which he feels it and
yeah,
the
yeah.
frequency with which he it's very odd.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Well, I mean, so so that intensity, right? So that kind of his, as the book kind of draws to an end, he's increasingly and vainly trying to control Lolita. He has to make it so she
Mm,
doesn't tell anybody else about their relationship,
yeah.
and she wants to, she's interested in other, boys her own age, and instead of him, and he's trying to control her, and he's finding it
Yeah.
harder and harder to do,
Hmm.
and eventually.
And the play is a real symbol of that, isn't it?
Yeah,
Her being
is
in
that
this
he allows
play.
her to be in the play, and he says she learned to act, and through learning to act, she learned to deceive me. So she asks him to go back out on another long road trip where she says, I want to go visit my hometown. She comes from some town in Ohio, I guess, and I want to see where my
It was
mother's
her idea.
buried. It was her idea. And
Yeah.
on this trip, she finally gets away from him, and she disappears, and he can't find
Yeah.
her anymore,
Hmm.
right? And then he loses her and for 3 years he sort of just drifts along. And finally he gets a letter from her saying, "Look, I'm 17 years old. I'm pregnant. I'm now married to this dude in somewhere in Appalachia." And he goes and he drives out to see her, and there's this scene kind of dripping with pathos where he sees her, and they want money. Her husband had been in the Korean War, I guess, and she's living in basically a shack in the mountains, and her husband's just kind of a simple guy, and he gives her the money, and he says to her, like, just, come back and live with me, and she says, no, honey. And he said she had never called me honey before. In other words, she just wasn't a child anymore.
Yeah.
And he's heartbroken. He gives her the money, and he just says, just tell me, who was it that took you away? And she tells him who it was. It was this guy. It was the playwright Quilty. Now,
Yeah.
Claire Quilty was also a pedophile. He's this
Yeah.
playboy, kind of debauched, guy who lives in a kind of a mansion and has a gang of friends, literary friends who just
Hangers
break
on and yeah.
hangers on who come in his house and drink his booze all the time, and he's a drug
Mm,
addict.
mm.
And now Humbert says okay, and he leaves. He knows he's never going to see her again, and he decides he's going to go to Quilty's house and kill him. And then you see this entire scene where he's drinking all the time, and he goes into Quilty's house, and Quilty's all hungover, and he gets out of bed, and he basically tells him, "I'm going to shoot you." And there's a sort of a tragic comic scene where he drops the gun, and they're the two old men wrestling on the ground, and and then finally he does kill Quilty in a quite an agonizingly long scene. He shoots him like 10 times, but he shoots him going up the stairs, and the guy Quilty goes into the bedroom and wraps himself in a blanket in his bed, and he shoots him through the blanket, and he goes downstairs, and the hangers on have broken in. They were supposed to go to a game, and they started to drink, and then somehow Quilty has gotten up out of the bed, made it down the stairs, soaked in blood, and he collapses, and and Humbert just leaves, and then he turns himself into the police, I guess. And
Yep.
now he's in jail, and he's writing this. He's writing what you're reading now to describe what his motivations were for what he did, right?
Yep.
And that's essentially the end of the book. And he says, "I've written this so that the world will know you. Generations hence will also know who you were, Dolores.
Mm.
And in a way, I think it is a bit confusing because you go, look, this guy was sort of a monster, but he clearly he was he just obsessed with her, or was this really love? I don't know. That's a hard question to answer, but it leaves you with that impression.
Yeah. Um, I think that's a big question, and let's get into that. But before
Sorry,
we do, it's okay. What's going on? You okay?
nothing. Somebody opened up the door to the office. I'm telling them to close the door.
Go away. Yeah. Before we do, that period of the story, the second road trip, I found both the most page-turny part
Yeah,
of the story, and then ultimately the most disappointing. So he is talking about how they seem to be being followed, right? And
that's right. Yeah,
at one point, like Dolores, she's like slipping off when they stop at like a gas station or whatever, and then she's clearly talking to someone, and then she's back, and then she disappears. Well, no, he goes through a period where he's like, actually, he's decided that he's paranoid. They're not being followed by someone. Because at one point, I remember in the narrative, he goes from being like he's being followed by someone in a specific car
yeah,
to, oh, the clever bastards have changed car, and they
yeah,
change car every day, and then you're like, oh, hang on, you're going crazy.
yeah,
But then it somehow flips back, and then she does go. Then he spends those 3 years you mentioned after she's gone. He goes round to all the motels they've been at and checks the visitors' logs.
yeah.
They were obviously staying in the same motel as him when he was there, using names that would deliberately resonate with him and her.
Right.
And but then again, it's never really clear to me if that bit's real. And then
Yeah, is
there's a
he
piece
imagining
where he
it?
then, yeah, I don't know. And then there's a piece where, so when he then says, oh, and he says like the intelligent reader will have already realized who it was she went off with, and
Yeah.
I'm like, I've got no idea. So obviously, I'm not the intelligent reader. And then when they mention this quilty guy, I'm like, who's that? I feel like I'm meant to know, but I don't actually know. And I'm like, oh, you might have mentioned his name once. Was the
Yeah. Well,
playwright, and
the
he
thing
was
is,
also they bumped into him in the on the first
yes,
road trip.
yes, they bumped into him on the
Um,
first road trip, and uh, his dead wife's dentist is also Quilty, so that's this guy's
yes,
cousin. So he
yeah,
goes later on to to the dentist to
dentist to
find
find
out
out
where
where
his
the other guy
house
is.
is,
Yeah.
and then insults the dentist and leaves.
Yeah, but I felt like that period of the story, as I say, it was quite patient, but then it felt like it never fully resolved into like,
Yeah.
yeah, it was strange. Like, are you being followed? Are you not being followed? Like, so I feel like we never really understood that part of it because,
I
yeah,
kind of get the idea that that Lolita planned the whole thing. Like I think she wanted
Exactly.
to go on this road trip as a way of her getting
Getting
away
away.
from him, you know,
Yeah.
because she knew that she'd have the opportunity to
Yeah.
slip away at a certain point. It was like stage, it was planned
And
ahead of
Quilty was
time, I
following the
think.
whole time,
Yes, Quilty was following.
potentially.
Right.
But yeah, yeah. So yeah. So anyway, back to your. I guess your big question there, interesting, is like, did he love her?
Yeah, I think he did. I think it's possible, right? I think he's disgusted by it. He understands that this love of his is an obsessive, destructive love, and that's probably why he has this death wish. He's clearly he's disgusted by himself. You know, he considers himself to be duplicitous. He's a liar. He's you know, he just knows he's not a good person, but nonetheless, he seems to feel that his love, at least to him, is the thing that in the end uh, kind of hardens him. You know, at least he can explain his actions with reference to love, which in the end I think is what he thinks is the redeeming part.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it's interesting. I think definitely like if you are to think that, a lot has to hinge on that final scene
Yes.
because he gives her the money and even more money than she asked for,
Mhm.
and she makes it. He kind of asks, like if I give you like more, will you come with me one last time, kind of thing, or
Right.
and she's like no,
Well,
but I still
you know
like the
what she
money.
says. I mean, do you understand how fundamentally like transactional she thought the relationship is? Because if you remember in
Yeah,
that final scene, she says to him, "You're going to give me the money. Do I have to go to a hotel with you? Is that what you want?" And he goes, "No, no, no, no. That's not what I want. You know,
yeah,
I want you to
yeah,
come back with me." And she goes, "No, no, no. I'm married now. You know,
yeah. It's
that's
not
over.
happening. Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know." And she,
but again, I wonder. So I think what he's done is monstrous. What he's
yes,
done to this girl, and we are told unreliable, unreliable narrator and whatnot. Is it possible that last scene equally is a bit inserted in there? You know what I mean?
well, once again, I think when they say he's unreliable, I think it's not that I don't think he creates events out of whole cloth. I think
Okay.
he describes them in such a way that you're supposed to feel, you're supposed to see things from his point of view. You're
His
supposed to
perspective.
feel, right, from his perspective, and you're supposed to feel sorry for him, right?
Mm.
He's manipulative. I don't think he's just making stuff up out of whole cloth, right? Especially events like that's the only reason I thought about what you said because while we were reading it, you said, you know, did he kill her? Did he not kill her? And I thought about that. I said, yeah, I mean, he's talking about killing her and he's fantasizing about killing her, but yet the way she dies, like it's not as if, you know, it's not like he came, you know, he tells you that he came home and he found her on the floor or something. She
Yeah, it's
goes
true.
out and she gets hit
Gets
by a
dragged,
car.
dragged by a car by like a
Right.
quarter of
So
a
in other
mile or
words, it's
something,
not
isn't it?
like
Yeah,
he could have set that up. You know, that just
yeah, true.
happened, you
Yeah,
know? Although he
yeah,
does say later that he blames himself for it. You know,
yeah.
he said, well, because he set up the set of circumstances that led to that,
Yeah.
which was
I
with
think
her
I think
finding his
sometimes
diary.
I think one of the yeah, to your point of like you see it from his perspective, but I think I'd always have this moment. You are lost in it, but then you kind of put the book down, don't you, at the end of the day, and go to bed or brush teeth or whatever, and you're just thinking, okay, so let me just get this straight. Let's just get this like series of events in order here.
Yeah.
So he's married a woman to have access to their early teenage year daughter. Then she's died. He's misled people into believing that he is the biological father of the daughter because he
Yeah.
makes up a story, doesn't he? Or maybe when I visited America like 15 years ago, or whatever.
I had an affair with her, and then I'm the real father of this child,
Yeah,
not you know the guy, the dead husband of Charlotte. You
yeah.
know.
Then he goes and yanks her out of summer camp and doesn't tell her mother is dead
Yes.
until it comes at such a point where she's basically just annoying him.
Hmm.
So he tells her, and he rapes her. Then he has a prolonged kidnapping with her where he repeatedly rapes her.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you just lay out the facts.
Yes, that is what happened. Yes, that is the series of
Like,
events.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's yeah, it is a very interesting case study in seeing something from someone's point of view that you can almost lose sight of those facts when he's just
Yes.
talking about the day-to-day life and struggle.
Yeah. Now, I think as a, extra textually, there's another thing where, you know, culturally, when this book came out, right? I think there was much like today. I think many people, it's a very sort of fashionable thing of, you know, I would use the word, the bien-pensants, right, are going to, it's a sign of refinement to read this book and say that you find it darkly comedic and romantic and things like that instead of really kind of a horrifying, because if you really look at
Yeah.
those events, it's a sign of liberal mindedness and sophistication to be able to
Yes,
say,
that's it. That's exactly it. I
yeah,
think you're right. That's it. Yeah, it's like look how detached like there's something low status about
yeah, from
just
from the from
recoiling
from the
at it's a young girl
moralizing
being
of
young.
the right.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
I'm above
I'm a but
the
yeah,
the
yeah. The
simple
mere flesh, the
morality of
mere
of,
yeah,
of
yeah.
hoi polloi and things of that
Yeah,
nature.
I think that's it. And that
Yeah,
explains I mean, I don't know anything didn't know anything about this Updike guys a second ago. But yeah, Martin Amis, Kingsley Amis. Because
very
that was
much.
one thing
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you, because yeah, to your point, darkly comedic and stuff. Did you find the book funny?
Yes, I found the book. I found a lot of what he said funny, and the way that he many the wordplay I found funny. I found a lot of the his descriptions of things funny. He has a very like piercing eye for describing the Americans of that
He's a
period.
horrible snob.
He's a
Is
horrible
that what
snob,
he's
and it's hilarious to me because
Hmm.
because he's able to really lampoon the intellectual, what's the word I'm looking for? The pretensions of, these New England Americans who want very much to impress a European intellectual like him, and he just
Hmm.
thinks that they're just horribly gauche. They're just really stupid and silly people. And he plays chess with this old French professor there who he regards as a moron. You
Because
know,
he's no good at chess for a start.
right, but he doesn't remember. He thinks that he has, multiple daughters. The guy can't remember the fact that he only has one. Um, and he just sucks at chess, and he regards him as fat and smelly and stupid. I just
Yeah,
love
yeah.
it. I mean, it's great. But that's the funny part to me when he lampoons these people because it is a reflection of people of that time. Americans
Hmm.
primarily. We talk about this all the time. You're British. I'm American.
Hmm.
We're conditioned to see Brits and the French as more,
Sophisticated
higher,
somehow.
sophisticated
Yeah.
and higher class than us.
Hmm.
And Americans of that time period so much wanted to be seen as sophisticated as well. But
Maybe
he
that's
he
why it
sees
doesn't
them as
work for me.
sophomoric.
Maybe that's why it doesn't work for me. Like maybe if Humbert Humbert was British, I might. But and there's definitely a lot like this. I think this is a very now type of comedy. Like the cool thing is to think everything's stupid, everything everyone's doing is stupid. Yeah, but I don't think it's funny. I don't think I laughed once. But
Yeah.
to be fair, I think for me, definitely laughter is something that happens in groups and in social. So I very rarely laugh at a book. To be honest, I find it quite
Well, I mean,
difficult
I
to laugh.
laughed at some of the things that he said, like that thing about the Saturnalia, the ex-convict Saturnalia with
Mm,
two fat old whores. Like it's just like he says things that are just so preposterous. Sometimes you just kind of
yeah,
laugh,
I can
and you
see
go
that.
like,
Yeah.
you know,
There's a Russell Brandian quality to the way he
yeah, yeah,
conjures
yeah,
up
yeah.
um,
Right.
imagery.
It's kind of a
Yeah,
shock. It's kind of a shock of laughter because what he
uh,
said is it's well put and it's really out there.
yeah, yeah.
But I will bring up one other thing, right? So I mentioned at the beginning that Nabokov, of course, people say, why was Nabokov so interested in this particular subject? Did he
Hmm.
have some sort of this type of an inclination himself? Now, no one has ever claimed that he did. No one has ever found any evidence. He may have just been an eccentric genius and thought this was an interesting subject, but with a lot of moral gray area for a novelist to explore, which I think is what he did. Now, after what's happened culturally in the last 10 years, the question arises, should people read a book like this, right? I think yes. I think that this is quite. I think it's useful to discuss these types of things, right? Especially when it comes to moral intuitions like this, things that cause us disgust to a certain extent are useful. I personally think that we have this obsession with not people now don't want to read books and movies, even by people that they disagree with politically. But if now, since this whole cancellation thing, if someone even has been accused of some minor, sexual impropriety, you're not supposed to buy their books, or they're not supposed to be platformed, or whatever. So, how
Well, I
do you
think
think?
sorry to cut in. I think that's kind of yeah, almost what I'm getting at. Like it doesn't. I feel like we've reached the point now where it doesn't even matter. Maybe 5, 10 years ago, the question would be, well, is Nabokov showing this in a positive light? Is he making us? That would be the question. Whereas I think now the question is, just the fact that he's talking about it is no, no. Do you
Right,
know what I mean?
right.
And I think that speaks to the fact that, as I say, that's you can't say the word paedophile on YouTube and get wide reach. It's like I mean,
Well,
there are. What if it was like sexology lectures, and criminology and stuff like that? Like it's bizarre that you've tabooed it completely out of
no, I agree.
mention. It's
Yeah.
Voldemort,
But
yeah.
what I was gonna ask you is, I think what I was going for was, do you feel that we, like people like us, like consumers of art, literature, things of that nature, do we have a responsibility to only consume, intellectual products, so to speak, that have come from people that we consider to be morally upright? Like, will you watch a Roman Polanski film? Will you watch Woody Allen films? And it's just because people are so historically illiterate that you go back far enough. I mean, Ben Jonson killed a man in a bar fight. Many of the Renaissance masters were whoremongers, and just the way history was. There is nobody who didn't do some of these types of things that are respected. And people just don't know because they go back more than 50 years, nobody knows anything. But do you feel as if you have a responsibility to say, I'm not, I don't, I think this guy is a bad guy, and I wouldn't want to read his book or something like that?
Absolutely not. I'm definitely I'm from the Ricky Gervais school of if he quotes someone and they say, "Oh, did you not know this guy was a racist?" Like, well, not in this quote, he's not. I think the work and
Yeah,
I feel there's this thing like Michael Jackson, right? On the topic of this, right?
yeah,
Phenomenal music. The idea that we should all just stop listening to it now is is crazy to me. That the music isn't doing that, and it's
yeah.
not even he's not even alive, so he's not getting rich off of it. Do you know? It just I think it's incredibly bizarre, and
Okay, well, what about like
I
R.
actually
Kelly? What about R. Kelly or
right.
P.
Well, I feel
Diddy
the same
or anyone
way.
like
Yeah,
this?
I feel the same about them too. But I mean, those are bad examples, I think, because the art produced by R. Kelly and P Diddy is of middling quality at best.
Sure,
But
sure.
I actually think we have a moral obligation to consume art by people we don't agree with, or even people we think is monstrous. Because I
Yeah,
think
I do agree with
it gives
that.
us
Yeah.
an insight into them, and I also think like what a lot of work. You will never have access to the darkest recesses of every person. So Michael Jackson's a great example. We spent 40 years listening to that music, and then you're just
Yeah.
suddenly going to turn it all off. Well, you may as well preemptively stop listening to everything because I guarantee
Yeah.
you,
You're gonna
everyone
find
could be
something you don't like about everyone.
exactly. Yeah,
I was thinking about this before too, about this question. You know, like the reason, for example, I don't read Mein Kampf is not because Hitler was a monster. It's because I don't think I'm going to learn anything valuable by reading that point of view. I know what he thought. It was a bunch of, it was a bunch of fucking posh, or whatever you guys would say. It's just a bunch of bullshit, about the moral superiority of the Germanic peoples. I know you think that, but that's not really.
not me. Just you're talking about Hitler, not me. Just to be for the record, um, I was born in Germany, so
Yeah.
yeah, I think, but I mean, you know, You should read Mein Kampf. I mean, like, what an important book, right? Don't agree with
Yeah,
it, obviously, but these are the inner ravings of a man who did an incredible amount of damage. It might be
sure.
worth understanding kind of where he was coming from.
Well,
Yeah,
that's what I would say about this book, right? I think this
right.
book is an example of, I could you could extend that, that logic to here. I mean, you may not like this, but this is a, this is a look inside, a mind that you would think, I would think if I thought like this guy that I was cursed. You know what I mean? I think
Yeah.
anybody who has this type of lust or compulsion to to love and possess someone that you're going to destroy in the process by doing that is an incredibly unfortunate thing. I
It's
think
an
the
interesting
san
question. I know they've done some things in Germany and the Netherlands. So I think it's been a moral question for quite some time, right?
Yeah.
What would happen if you were to turn up at a police station and say, or a hospital, and say, I am attracted to children. I don't want to ever do anything about it. Can you help me? Would you just be put in prison? You haven't acted on it. Would you just be watched? Is there anything we can do for you as a society? Like it's an
You
interesting
can
thing.
chemically castrate the person. That's
Chemically
pretty much
castrate
it.
you, maybe. Yeah,
That's it.
yeah.
But then
But yeah, so
that's what they did to what's his name. That's what they did
Turing.
to
Yeah,
Turing, and he ended up
yeah.
committing suicide. So I'm not sure if
I'm not
and
remembering
that
what
was
person.
over his homosexuality, which
No.
we've I think
But to
thankfully
the
stopped treating that way.
to the point of just don't talk about it. I mentioned before we started recording here. I don't normally do this, but I'm trying to embrace this modern world. I asked ChatGPT a question about this book, and it started answering it. Like you can see it doing its answer, and then it just stopped, and a red thing came up and said, "This breaches our guidance or guideline rules." It's a
Mm,
it's a book that you can buy in a bookshop.
yeah,
But ChatGPT has decided it cannot talk about it,
very
which is strange.
bizarre.
And similar to, I don't know if when this you saw when this deep seek Chinese AI came out, and people would film themselves, screenshot themselves by asking it about Tiananmen Square, and it would start answering before it went. We don't want to talk about this kind of thing.
Yeah,
It's interesting. We've got our own taboos. We've got our own landmines. Because yeah, it wasn't like I was trying to get ChatGPT to say Humbert Humbert is a great hero of our time, or that
right.
it's the only authentic love story of the 20th century.
Like Vanity Fair seems to have thought. Could you imagine
I
saying
mean,
something like
I'm
that
amazed
now?
Vanity Fair is still in print now after that.
It's an amazing thing to say.
Mm,
But once again, I think, like I said before, I think that quote is an expression of sort of, high class posturing
look
of that
how
time. Look how
above, look
sophisticated
how
I am.
above your petty taboos I
Yeah,
am.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah.
think I think Nabokov knew that that was the reaction he was going to get. He was going to get a split reaction among people with intellectual pretensions who they feel would, that they want to prove that they're above normal moral
Mm,
restraint. They would say, oh, this is a wonderful comedic love story. And most people are going to say, this is horrible. Yeah, how could this man do this? And should I even be reading this? It had to be released through a publisher of erotica. And
right.
I think that all comes into play. And I'm sure Nabokov must have realized what was going to happen. I think that protected him in a certain way because we already knew in America, at least, that we have this robust legal protection against free speech. And
Mm,
in the 50s, they had already had certain main, for example, the famous British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell was famously prevented from teaching at NYU because he was an atheist. And he was going to teach a class. This was in the 1940s, and he was supposed to teach a class about mathematics. But one of the parents of the students found out that he had written about atheism, and not only atheism, about his kind of a bit libertine views about sex and teaching children about the human body young. And they said this guy's a creep. He shouldn't be teaching kids at a public university. And they had a hearing, and they rescinded the offer of his professorship. So that was a signature moment of shame for America, I think, that people didn't, that the intellectuals didn't want to repeat. So I think it was a fertile time for a book like this that sort of pushed those boundaries in America because you'd have a hearing, maybe the court would
Interesting.
say, is this pornography, is it not pornography? And even then, when I was in school, we studied literature. We did a whole thing about what constitutes pornography. Legally, it's very fuzzy. It says something
I
along
know
the
it when I
lines
see
of,
it, as they say.
I'll know it when I see it. It has to appeal to the prurient interest. What does that
Mm,
mean? You know, what could be titillating to one person may not be to another person. It's just a matter
mm,
of perspective. So it's very difficult to. It's been very difficult in America to keep books like this from being published, and it's probably a good thing.
mm.
But God knows. I mean, look at now. I mean, they want to remove. For the last 50 years they've been trying to remove Mark Twain books from like Tom
Right.
Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn because they use the
Yep.
N word.
Yep.
And even though the argument of the book is very much
Context.
anti-racist, you know.
Yeah, yeah. The
So
context doesn't matter though because you've mentioned it, and that's the
yeah,
problem. Yeah,
right.
yeah. It's interesting. I think he must have. I read that he did a lot of research into what these people think and say, and maybe that's sort of why it comes across as authentic. But of course, it's so authentic, probably why some people have questioned
Well,
him.
I mean, I think that's a common thing too. When someone is this masterful that they'll think, for example, my father pointed out that when I was a kid, this is before Harry Potter, of course. When we were kids, if you wanted
Mm,
to read, a fantasy epic, you read The Lord of the Rings, which I read when I was in my early teens. Maybe I was 12, 13 years old. I read all the books. I read The Hobbit and I read the trilogy.
mhm.
And he said when these books came out in the 1960s, see, there you go. He said when these books came out in the 1960s, Tolkien was a professor of Germanic languages at Oxford,
Yeah,
right near you, and
yeah.
he invented the Elven language based on ancient Scandinavian, ancient
Runes and
Norwegian
whatnot. Yeah.
languages, and it was so in depth. And he has these genealogies and histories. He said a lot of people were convinced, at least in America, that this was real, that he had access to
Wow.
historical
Oh,
materials
wow.
that proved it. And he said, no, 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 I just made this up. But they said it was such an incredible and in-depth thing that people thought this
Yeah.
must be real. And in a certain way, I think people think that way about Lolita. They say, well, how could this man have access to the inner thoughts of someone who's a PDF file that he himself must have been that way. And I think
Yeah.
that's a temptation of anyone who is able to write imaginatively in such a way that they truly inhabit the inner life of a character.
Right. I mean, I think especially because presumably a lot of people would have seen him as the intellectual European walking around the New World with his nose turned up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So probably they thought he's written himself here.
Well, as a final note, I mean, he Nabokov also wrote a series of short stories called with a character called Pnin, Pnin. It's just delightful. The guy is the antithesis of Nabokov himself, and it's just so comedically rich. It's basically he's a professor of Russian at in Nabokov's milieu, the New England American university scene of the 1950s. But unlike Nabokov, who knows English so well that he's able to write puns that many native speakers would not be able to understand. Pnin is like he's kind of oafish. He can't speak English very well, and he's trying to climb the ladder at this university, but he can't master English, and he keeps
Mm.
all these misunderstandings and social gaffes that come from it. I think people that Nabokov is often thought of solely for this work, but he he wrote other things, and I think
Yeah, yeah.
I
I'd be
think
keen to
this
read him after this, I think.
yeah.
Yeah, keen to
I
read
would
it.
I would recommend the Panine stories. There's a book of short stories called Nabokov's Dozen that has very good short stories in it. and he has a book of poems and prose that are kind of biographical called Speak Memory, and there's another one called Pale Fire, all of which I
Mm.
have. I haven't read the last two yet, although I plan to do it. I'm just reading his short stories now, and they're just great. They're so I get that feeling when I read them when I feel like I've had contact with genius. The clarity of this
Mm.
man's mind was just incredible, and his
Yeah.
ability to write so evocative, just a master prose stylist. It makes it so that for a little while afterwards, as I said, I find it hard to read other things because
Mm.
it just lets me down. It's almost like it's almost like taking MDMA or something. It fires your endorphins and it leads you. It spikes your serotonin so high that everything after that, then you feel down. You know?
It's interesting because I had the opposite feeling after reading it. I felt like I needed to get into a mind that wasn't that guy's mind,
Yeah, I can
which
see
is a
that
testament
too.
to how well it's written and how it gets you in there. But it is not pleasant always to be there.
No, certainly
Um,
not.
and that was my feeling. I mean, I think there's a couple of things to take from this, because I always said the reason I wanted to read these books was because I think there's a lot of insight and a lot of, wisdom in these older books. And yeah, I think that kind of the big takeaway for me is how everyone's the hero in their own story. You kind of do realize that everyone's perspective humanizes them. But I think also his inability, it's so funny because he puts you in that guy's mind so well, but then Humbert's inability to see Dolores's mind, or in any way see, to realize that when you use people,
Yeah.
be aware of what they're experiencing, and
Yeah,
there's
I mean,
something.
I think no matter what you say, this is one of those books that if you come back to it in a few years, you'll get a different. I think you'll read a
Yeah,
different book, and that's
I
the
can
that
see
to
that.
me that's the litmus test of a true work of art. So
Mm.
whether you find it unpleasant or not, which I could see that as well, I think it's certainly at least it's an experience, and you can say I'm sure we could say much more about it.
Oh, sure.
But
That's
I feel
probably enough
glad
for now.
we're able to talk about this and produce these videos that I'm absolutely sure will make it to millions of viewers
Absolutely.
to
And I mean,
edify
hopefully I haven't got the old bill at my door tomorrow morning after talking about this. Yeah.
the old bill at my door. All
The
right,
Vlad.
man. All right. So for the what's the name of the podcast?
The Light Brigade.
The Light Brigade for the Light Brigade podcast. It's Vito and Lucas. Have a
Thank
nice
you.
month. We'll see you again next time.